o'clock in New York. Think of it as the exact moment when Donald Trump lit the match, a zero-hour nexus event in American history that would propel our entire country careening toward mayhem. Quote, "Be there will be wild." It's no small wonder that we're learning today just how interested Special Counsel Jack Smith appears to be in the chaotic hours before that tweet was sent. Because as the January 6th Select Committee made perfectly clear, that invitation to the U.S. Capitol on January 6th, that tweet, quote, "Be there will be wild," was the tweet that set off a violent chain reaction that resulted in a deadly attack on our seat of government. CNN is now reporting that the special counsel is asking witnesses about a contentious Oval Office meeting on December 18th, 2020. More than a month after the election and mere days after the Electoral College in all 50 states made official the decision of the American people. In short, that Trump had lost the election. So in that moment, the disgraced ex-president had before him two paths. Behind door number one, amid his campaign and hit the end of the line, maintain some scrap of dignity, keep in place a peaceful transfer of power, step aside, kicking and screaming notwithstanding. But behind door number two, not just fall, but vault into the abyss, commit to anti-democratic measures by flexing presidential power the office never even possessed. Of course, we all know the rest of the story from there, right? That on this night in December, this crucial juncture, a 6-hour cage match essentially unfolded deep inside the White House. On one side, what some in Trump's own White House called, quote, Team Crazy. Names you know, people like Sidney Powell, Michael Flynn, Rudy Giuliani. Team Crazy weaseled its way inside the White House thanks to the help of a junior staffer. And Team Crazy ends up alone with Trump. Sidney Powell describes it in her own words.
In fact, you did get to see the president without an appointment.
We did.
How much time did you have alone with the president? And I say alone, you had other people with you, but
right
from his aides before the crowd came running?
Probably no more than 10 or 15 minutes.
Was in that...
I bet Pat Cipollone set a new land speed record.
Pat Cipollone setting a land speed record, as she joked there, along with fellow attorney Eric Hirschman, were what would come to be known as card-carrying members of Team Normal. News of the ongoing feud or powwow with Trump set off a 5-alarm fire. Listen.
So that was the first point that I had recognized, okay, there was nobody in there from the White House. Mark's gone. What's going on right now?
I opened the door and I walked in. I saw General Flynn. I saw Sidney Powell sitting there. I was not happy to see the people who were in the Oval Office.
Explain why.
Well, again, I don't think they were providing. Well, first of all, the overstock person, I've never knew who this guy was. Actually, the first thing I did, I walked in, I looked at him, and I said, "Who are you?" And he told me. I don't think any of these people were providing the president with good advice, and so I didn't understand how they had gotten in.
The overstock person. So what ensues is a tug of war to determine what Donald Trump's next steps will be. It's a tug of war that went from the Oval Office to the West Wing all the way to the residence. There was screaming, there was swearing, there were challenges to fight, to physically brawl right there in the White House. There were plans to seize voting machines, to invoke emergency powers, to short-circuit our very democracy. When the dust quasi-settles, Trump has settled on a decision. He has chosen door number two. Quote, "Be there will be wild" is the tweet he sends. It's a plan and a tweet that determine the course of American history. Over to you, Jack Smith. It's where we begin today with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former lead investigator for the January 6th Select Committee, Tim Hafey, is back. Also joining us, a member of that committee, Democratic Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, is here. There may be no single event that the committee more successfully brings to life than this meeting. And it's through the hard-earned testimony of Pat Cipollone that you learn of just how the low regard that they hold Team Crazy, Mike Flynn, Sidney Powell, and the Overstock person. Congresswoman, explain to us what you think the significance is of Jack Smith focusing a lot of his questions on this meeting and this time period.
Well, obviously, we don't know. But as the committee pointed out, there was a multifaceted effort by the ex-president to overturn the election. This was part of that plan, and it didn't really pan out. After midnight, the effort or the plan to have the military take over, rerun the election, seize voting machines and the like were not going anywhere. And it was then that the ex-president sent his famous tweet asking people to come on January 6th, promising that it would be wild. So I assume that Mr. Smith is taking a look.
You can get Speechelo for a ridiculously low one-time fee and no monthly recurrings. Outsourcing the creation of a single voiceover will cost you more than the price of this offering. Let's quickly recap why you should get Speechelo today. You'll be able to transform any text into speech. You'll get over 30 human-sounding voices. You'll be able to create voiceovers in over 23 languages, and you'll be able to create as many voiceovers as you want. Well, what are you waiting for? Click the Buy Now button below and profit from our special offer right now. And remember, you are covered by our 60-day money-back guarantee.
Taking a look at every aspect, really, of the roadmap that the January 6th committee laid out of the various efforts, multifaceted efforts to retain power despite the election, and this meeting was one of them.
Tim, this meeting seems important on a couple of levels. One, the premeditation is clearly established by the timeline, right? This meeting happens way before January 6th. So the notion that anything that happens on January 6th is spontaneous is asinine, right? Trump has convened a meeting. Trump has forum shopped because the lieutenants he wanted to carry out the overturning the election have bailed on him. Barr says it's BS. Cipollone, is I think it's Hirschman that is, almost ready to go to blows with Team Crazy, Flynn Powell, and Overstock person. Tell me what you think the significance is of this meeting being in focus by Jack Smith's team.
I think it's a tremendously important inflection point, Nicole, in the events that lead up to January 6th. What happens at that meeting is that a handful of really crazy, desperate ideas are proposed. Seizing voting machines, having the U.S. military seize voting machines. There's actually a draft executive order that is shown during this meeting, citing a national security provision that suggests there's evidence of foreign powers somehow interfering with our election. No such evidence existed. He also contemplates appointing Sidney Powell as a special counsel to investigate election fraud. Again, there had been no evidence of widespread election fraud, so there's nothing to investigate, and certainly no basis to appoint a special counsel when the Justice Department had been looking into that. So he's knocking on doors that are locked for good reason, because they're baseless. And then in the middle of the night at 1:42 a.m., after that crazy meeting, he turns to his final, most desperate ploy, which is launching a mob at the Capitol, and he tweets, "Be there, will be wild." We had so many people tell us, Nicole, people who were at the Capitol, that they went because of that tweet, because of the president's direct invitation. Stephen Ayers, who was a hearing witness for us, Carpenter from Erie, Pennsylvania, Trump supporter, believed that what he read on Facebook about the election being infected with fraud, he went to Washington because of that tweet, because he felt like the president invited him. And a lot of people told us that. So the tweet which comes when all those doors are locked during the crazy meeting, ends up being, I think, as you said in the lead-in here, the sort of spark that starts the fire that blazes at the Capitol on January 6th.
Well, Tim, importantly, it puts him atop the chain of command of something other than the U.S. military. I mean, stand back and stand by was the call to arms, but be there will be wild is the call to charge. Tell me how it ties him to the violence that takes place on January 6th.
Yeah, almost every time I join you, we talk about the special counsel's primary task is evidence of the president's intent, the president's knowledge, the president's awareness, the president's specific desire to interrupt the joint session. His tweet after the crazy ideas are thrown around at that meeting, really importantly, is evidence of his state of mind and his intent. Be there will be wild is a direct invitation, and it is from the leader of the free world, who's also the leader of the conspiracy to disrupt the joint session. That's why it's important to Jack Smith. It's yet another example of evidence of intent, all of which is leading inexorably, I think, and the committee recommended, to evidence of crimes that Jack Smith ultimately will bring forth.
Congresswoman, let me play a little bit more of the evidence that you and your colleagues developed. This is from Pat Cipollone about this internal struggle on this day, on this night.
What response did you get when you asked Ms. Powell and her colleagues where's the...
A variety of responses based on my current recollection, including, can't believe you would say something like, things like this, like, what do you mean, where's the evidence? You should know, and things like that, or, a disregard, I would say, a general disregard for the importance of actually backing up what you say with facts.
And, then there was discussion of, well, we don't have it now, but we will have it or whatever.
I mean, if it had been me sitting in his chair, I would have fired all of them that night and had them escorted out of the building.
But Derek and I both challenged what she was saying. And she says, well, the judges are corrupt. And I was like, everyone? Every single case that you've done in the country you guys lost, every one of them is corrupt, even the ones we appointed? And I'm being nice. I was much more harsh to her.
Congresswoman, 60 of the cases were lost. One was won on a procedural ground. This absence of evidence, this knowledge that the claims of fraud were lies, is a theme that the committee developed layer upon layer upon layer, and at every point along the timeline. What is the significance of revealing that even Sidney Powell, the craziest of Team Crazy, maybe that's unfair to Mike Flynn, who wants that title. Anyway, among the craziest of Team Crazy, has no evidence. She can't even hold something up as fake evidence. There isn't any. And her explanation for why there isn't any is that even the judges Trump appointed were quote, corrupt. It seems that this is important also, that at no point in trying to overturn his defeat did anyone on Team Normal or Team Crazy claim to have any evidence of fraud.
That's correct. They had none because there isn't any. And the president knew that. He'd been told repeatedly by his own people that there was no fraud that would change the outcome of the election by officials who investigated these wild claims and found them to be false. He knew it wasn't true, and he still wanted to cling to power. The Team Crazy, for lack of a better word, had no evidence to show him because there was no evidence, and yet they wanted to work with him to keep power even though he lost the election. As Judge Carter said in the California evidence case, a coup.
So, Tim, let me read a little bit more from CNN's reporting on this. What CNN is reporting is that multiple sources are telling them that investigators have asked several witnesses before the grand jury and during interviews about this meeting. That some witnesses were asked about the meeting months ago, while several others have faced questions about it more recently. And that includes Rudy Giuliani, someone you and I talk about often. Tim, let me show you Rudy Giuliani's own description of the fighting on that night. This is Rudy speaking for Team Crazy, I guess, and Eric Hirschman speaking for Team Normal.
I think that it got to the point where the screaming was completely out there. I mean, you got people walk in, it was late at night, it had been a long day, and what they were proposing, I thought was nuts.
I'm gonna categorically describe it as, you guys are not tough enough. Or maybe I put it another way, you're a bunch of excuse the expression, but I'm almost certain the word was used.
Flynn screamed at me that I was a quitter and everything, kept on standing up and turning around and screaming at me. And at a certain point I had it with him. So I yelled back. I had to come over, or sit your effing ass back down.
Tim, a lot of evidence was presented of how intense this fight was, and this juncture that Rudy and Hirschman don't even disagree on the intensity builds to this crescendo. The word that's bleeped out is where Trump thinks that famous people can touch women. Tell me the significance of the emotion of this duel this night between these two sides.
It's actually, Nicole, when I watched that, really similar to the January 3rd meeting in the Oval Office when the president contemplates replacing his acting attorney general. The same criteria is put forth. At least he will fight for me. At least he's willing to do something, is what the president says as the purported basis to replace his leadership at the Department of Justice with an unqualified acting AG, Jeff Clark. Same thing is raised on December 18th. The currency there is who's going to fight, which is the wrong criteria, right? The criteria should be, well, who has the facts and who has the evidence and who has the better argument as to what's the appropriate way forward. This sort of sense of you have to fight until your last breath is a little bit crazy when there are no facts or legal pathways that would justify that fight. So again, Jack Smith is interested in what was the president focused on? Is he focused on who's going to fight for me? Or is he focused, as he should be, on the facts and the law?
Well, we know the answer, don't we, Tim?
I would say,
go ahead, Congresswoman.
It's really just who is loyal enough to commit crimes for the ex-president to keep him in power. Right. That's really what the bottom line was, both at the meeting in December and then later with the Department of Justice. He knew that what he was doing was not lawful, and he needed minions to help him commit a crime.
Well, let me ask both of you then. I mean, is minions, do we think Jack Smith is replacing the word minions with co-conspirators? I mean, do you see evidence, Congresswoman, that this could be the group, this group that we've described, that the committee, I think, successfully branded as Team Crazy? Do you think Jack Smith may be eyeing them as co-conspirators?
Well, the committee made referrals to the Department of Justice. One was a conspiracy to defraud the United States. Clearly, these were people conspiring with the president to overturn the election. Now, Mr. Smith has to make the decision on whether this activity meets the standard in the code and whether he has sufficient evidence. But it looks like he's working pretty hard to put this case together.
So, Tim, same question to you. And the CNN report does include that witnesses have been asked about the Overstock guy. I believe it's Mr. Byrne, as well as Mr. Eastman, Mr. Flynn, Sidney Powell. I mean, are these the potential targets of a conspiracy to overturn the election and defraud the American people?
Yeah. So first of all, Team Crazy is not something that the committee came up with. That was something that Bill Stepien, who was President Trump's campaign manager, he himself Yeah, he himself defined team as team crazy. Again, that was President Trump's own campaign manager who gave the team that name. Look, I think to be a conspirator, there has to be an agreement, right? That's what the law of conspiracy is. Two or more people agree to commit a crime. You have to prove that someone took a step toward commission of that crime, an overt act. Not every conspirator needs to actually have personally committed some sort of overt act. So I think Jack Smith, when he's looking at the contours of this conspiracy, beyond the leader of the conspiracy, the former president, is evaluating whose conduct evidenced an agreement to obstruct this official proceeding. Specific intent, just as we've talked about, is the standard. And then who took a step in that direction. Somebody that just advocated it may not be charged, even though legally he could be if he shared the goal, he or she. So absolutely, the lawyers on Team Crazy are absolutely targets and are potentially charged co-conspirators if they agreed with the president to take steps to obstruct the proceeding without basis in law and fact, and particularly if they did something, if like Rudy Giuliani testifying in these mock hearings around the country, going out publicly to repeat discredited claims of voter fraud. That puts him, very much in the center of the conspiracy, not just in his head, but by his actions.
I mean, Tim, isn't Trump taking that next step by sending the tweet, quote, "Be there, will be wild"?
Absolutely. That's an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. Yes. Again, I think there's no question that he is the leader, that he is the decider. He is the one to whom all of these ideas are proposed. On December 18th, on January 3rd, with respect to DOJ, all of it. But others helped them. Others supported it. That's why I think what Jack Smith's looking at is a conspiracy. How broad and how wide does that conspiracy extend? The select committee recommended John Eastman, Rudy Giuliani, Jeff Clark. But Jack Smith is looking at a broader list of possible co-conspirators, and we'll have to make hard decisions about sort of who's in a charged conspiracy and who's not.
Congresswoman, Jack Smith is... Oh, go ahead.
I just think you can't look at this, important as this meeting was, you can't look at it out of context with the things that followed in January, especially January 6th, as well as the individuals that the committee was unable to interview, most especially Mark Meadows, Mr. Stone, and others who were working with the ex-president. We had evidence of direct communications. So presumably, Mr. Smith will be getting that information. And when you put it with the information on this meeting, I think there are some very interesting possibilities.
Congresswoman, that was my question. I mean, Jack Smith is now post interviews with Meadows and Pence. And I wonder what connective tissue you would have liked to have developed in conversations with Meadows and or Mike Pence about this meeting, the subsequent tweet, and everything that follows.
Well, Meadows was everywhere. He knows practically everything. And so he is a key witness for things that we wanted to find out about and probably things that we never knew about. Certainly, Roger Stone seemed to be playing a key role in this and actually leading up to it. And we do know that the podcast from the witness who has been convicted, who refused to testify to us, really was prescient. It said, January 6th is not going to be what you thought it was. You're going to be surprised. They were talking the night before. So there's a lot to know.
Right. They all seem to know just how bad it was going to be. Rudy Giuliani tells Cassidy Hutchinson, Cass, it's going to be wild. It's going to be something, all using the same words. Congresswoman Zoe Lofgren, It's an unbelievable turn of events, and we're so grateful to get to talk to you today about it. Thank you so much for starting us off. Tim sticks around. We will have much more on this when our panel joins me and Tim in the next block. Later in the broadcast, the lawyers prosecuting Donald Trump in the classified documents case are facing an avalanche of actual threats, physical threats, what they're up against and what's being done about those threats. Plus, the MAGA movement may no longer be having its moment in the sun, combusting in just about every way imaginable. We'll talk about that and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere today.
Is calling on his supporters to descend on Washington, D.C. January 6th.
He is now calling on we, the people, to take action and to show our numbers.
We're going to only be saved by millions of Americans moving to Washington.
Some who have since been indicted for their involvement in the attack on the Capitol also responded. One of them posted on the 19th, quote, calling all patriots, be in Washington, D.C., January the 6th. This wasn't organized by any group. DJT has invited us, and it's going to be wild. Some of the online rhetoric turned openly homicidal and white nationalist, such as, why don't we just kill them, every last Democrat, down to the last man, woman, and child? And it's time for the day of the rope. White revolution is the only solution.
Most people have no clue that in 2023, the best way to make money on
They would act on that, right? They would set up a gallows to hang none other than Mike Pence. Joining our coverage, national investigative reporter for the Washington Post, Carol Leonnig, former FBI counterintelligence agent Pete Strzok. Tim is still with us. Carol, you and I have talked a lot about what Jack Smith may be doing in this part of the murky, dark, dangerous forest that is Trump's role in the command and control over the violence that ensued. We've talked about the lack of maybe obvious public-facing chain of command from the insurrectionists and the guys with the zip ties to Trump. It does appear that Jack Smith is probing this area to try to maybe investigate it from the other direction, from be there, be wild, to what Jamie Raskin describes there, the call to action and the actual crimes committed by the insurrectionists on that day.
Yes, and Nicole, the reason I think you and I have both had our noses so focused and our eyes so focused on this particular section is, what is the potential connective tissue? If the Department of Justice had an idea of building brick by brick from the riot and the insurrection up to whoever the mastermind was, there were findings by FBI agents and by Justice Department prosecutors that they didn't see a connection between the violent insurrection and some sort of leadership at the White House directing those militia men who were on a warpath to take the Capitol by force. However, what's really interesting is, and as the January 6th committee has highlighted over and over again, the way in which the meetings in December, the cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs meetings with Michael Flynn suggesting they seize voting machines, with Sidney Powell saying she should be named the special counsel to investigate fraud in the election. Those mid-December meetings at the White House had senior White House staff so upset they were trying to block certain members coming into this meeting from actually getting inside the West Wing and seeing the president. That's the level of concern there was about people like the Pillow Man and Michael Flynn getting inside the White House and being able to pull on the ear of Donald Trump. But as you'll remember, after this nearly 6-hour-long meeting, December 18th, that involves shouting and screaming and people coming in on conference calls, and the National Security Advisor being asked, is there a possibility we can seize the machines? Screaming, shouting. Donald Trump leaves the meeting at some point, goes to his dining room, comes back for another round of all these ideas in which people that want to have his ear and have some crazy ideas suggest he can hold on to power in different manners. This is something the January 6th committee, I think, nicely focused on in trying to show that there were moments that Donald Trump was essentially showing his desire and his intent to block a government proceeding, to obstruct a government proceeding, and why, in the end, they recommended, I think, to the Department of Justice that there was significant evidence to suggest he had an intent and a plan and was running a Hydra-headed conspiracy to exactly do that, obstruct the proceeding.
You know, Tim, I want to show you some of the evidence Jamie Raskin teased out and developed in the public hearings. But to Carol's point, everyone close to Trump is asked to testify before the committee. And on these questions about violence and on organizing the events, they took the fifth, which was their right. But nobody defended Trump. Nobody said he hated the violence. Nobody said he privately discouraged the insurrectionists. No one said he didn't want anybody to come. And no one said to you in a taped deposition, in a public hearing or otherwise, in a transcript released after the committee stopped existing, that Trump was worried about his vice president. There's not a scrap of evidence in the public domain that Trump was anything other than seeding the violence, welcoming the violence, and celebrating the violence as it's happening.
Yeah, Nicole, just exactly right. We had testimony from the people who would provide information about the president's statements. And again, there were very few. Most of the folks we interviewed invoked an executive privilege or an attorney-client privilege and would not share with us direct communications with the president. But a few people did. Cassidy Hutchinson, for example, said that the president, or that Mark Meadows reported during the riot in a conversation with Pat Cipollone, Pat, he doesn't want to do anything, right? A secondhand but direct account of something that the president said or how he felt during the riot. And as you said, no one told us that in the days before or on January 6th, did he express concern about violence? He noted it. He said on January 5th, the night before, he had the doors to the Oval Office open, and he was listening to a rally just down the street at Freedom Plaza, at which Mike Flynn and Ali Alexander and others were speaking. And he said, these people are very, very angry. Not like, oh no, but rather kind of excitedly, wow, these people are really fired up about the stolen election. So there is no evidence of his attempt in any way to quash violence, to oppose violence. It wasn't until he's forced, sort of almost reluctantly kicking and screaming at 4:17 p.m. after the riot had been raging for hours, that he issues that statement in the Rose Garden, which kind of tepidly says, well, we love you, but you should go home.
Yeah. After we now know from Mark Meadows' text, the entire primetime lineup of Fox News has pleaded with him to do so they don't, quote, ruin our legacy, according to Laura Ingraham. Let me show you, Pete Strzok, the evidence Congressman Jamie Raskin develops on the part of the committee tying the tweet to the extremist movements themselves.
He asked Pat Cipollone if he had the authority to name me special counsel, and he said yes. And then he asked him if he had the authority to give me whatever security clearance I needed, and Pat Cipollone said yes. And then the president said, okay, I'm naming her that, and I'm giving her security clearance. And then shortly before we left, and it totally blew up, was when Cipollone and or Hirschman and whoever the other young man was.
As much as I love the conversation about Team Crazy and Sidney Powell, that's not the one I wanted to show you, Pete Strzok. Let me show you this one. My mistake. This is Jamie Raskin tying the conduct of the extremists themselves to Trump's December 19th tweet.
And now Donald Trump is calling on his supporters to descend on Washington, D.C., January 6th.
He is now calling on we, the people, to take action and to show our numbers.
We're going to only be saved by millions of Americans moving to Washington.
Some who have since...
So, Pete, we're struggling to find the right piece of tape, but everyone, I think, that's familiar with this program and familiar with Tim's investigative work knows that what Jamie Raskin's public hearing was focused on was how that tweet operationalizes the incredibly organized efforts of the extremists on that day, the carrying of zip ties, the chatter that's picked up by an FBI field office in Norfolk, the people that don't go to the ellipse, right, to, quote, walk to the Capitol with Trump, the people that instead go straight to the U.S. Capitol. And it's most, I think it's described in the most harrowing terms in the testimony from the law enforcement officers protecting the Capitol and the Republicans and the Democrats inside of it that day who engaged in what they describe as medieval combat. Talk about this being a focus for DOJ, for Jack Smith and his investigators. The call from Trump on December 19th, be there, be wild, and the response on the 6th.
Well, Nicole, I think it clearly shows a certain amount of premeditation and planning when you look at the meeting in the White House, when you look at, frankly, a large number of congressmen and women who showed up at the White House around the same time who may have had some sort of involvement, certainly in the fake elector plot, but we don't know, certainly on the outside, the extent of their involvement. But all these things come together in this mid-December timeframe, and it's clear now as we look at the results, as we look at the trials and the testimony and evidence that came out from the trials of the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. This was not a spontaneous, hey, what are you doing tomorrow night? Let's drive to D.C. and go protest. This is something that came together over weeks and weeks, and certainly Trump's statements, his tweets, the be there, be wild, points to something that was brewing for several weeks. And again, as I've said, as we've said together before, certainly causes the question to be asked, where was the federal law enforcement response to all this? Did anybody, did Pat Cipollone or Mark Meadows or anybody else in the White House hearing these plans, hearing this sort of acceptance and excitement about potential violence, hearing the use of the National Guard to seize voting machines and redo potentially the election, did a single person turn to FBI Director Chris Wray or anybody at DOJ and say, hey, look, there is not just one, but there are a number of really concerning things that are all coming together at once that point to the potential of violence? And it's a reasonable question. And frankly, I have yet to hear a good answer about why this wasn't done and why everybody was so apparently caught flat-footed on January the 6th.
Yeah, I mean, Carol Leonnig, it's a part of this that remains incredibly opaque. And we talked yesterday about the committee's hurdles for investigating folks that Liz Cheney made abundantly clear she wanted to know more from, and that was her fellow Republicans in the House. The other black box really is what Pete is articulating. There was not really an intelligence failure. This was happening. I mean, we pulled the clips. Those weren't classified. Those weren't secret. Those were on right-wing media sources. The tweets about bringing zip ties, about where the tunnels were, those were posted on right-wing channels that were open source. They lead to the Norfolk memo. What, if anything, do you think is being examined about the government itself? Or do you think, as with Rod Rosenstein's supervision of the Mueller probe, Jack Smith is simply investigating crimes?
You know, there's no reason for Jack Smith to investigate the FBI's. I hate to say it this way, but there's no real reason for him to use a grand jury to investigate and question people about Mr. Byrne, Ms. Powell, Mr. Giuliani in their meetings to figure out how the FBI dropped the ball. But I can't emphasize enough how right Pete and you are to emphasize this element, because, I mean, we were chilled as reporters as we combed through not just the Norfolk memo, which the Washington Post first wrote on, but other clear in the open warnings in which domestic extremist groups were talking not on private dark web, but on open online sites about be ready to drop police. It was, you know, even right now, the hair goes up on the back of my neck about why federal law enforcement and Homeland Security officials didn't take that seriously. But I'd like to rewind a little to something all four of us have discussed quite a bit, which is that nutty meeting, December 18th, and Peter mentions the Congress members who were part of it. If I had subpoena power, and I've said this before to you, Nicole, I would want to be able to question several members who said, again, as they left the White House, Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, posted a video which she said, we've just left a wonderful meeting with the president and we have a plan for January 6th and how to stop this deal. Well, I'd like a little truth serum on what was that plan exactly. There's no question that the effort was to block the certification, but I've always wanted to know, why can't our law enforcement get the answers to the questions from lawmakers? You were part of this. You Freedom Caucus members were making a plan. Ali Alexander, the permit rally organizer for Stop the Steal and a Trump supporter, Ali Alexander was bragging not very many days after the insurrection that he and 3 Freedom Caucus members made a plan with the president to bring maximum pressure on Congress to stop the peaceful transfer of power. So let's hear what that was exactly and what Donald Trump's role in it was.
Yeah, and what is it that they know on the 5th to tell Mike Pence's Secret Service agent details that he's at grave risk? He's really threatened tomorrow, if not that the other members of Congress are in on the conspiracy with Trump. Caroline, today you've posed more vexing questions than answers, but we thank you for doing that. Thank you for spending time with us today on these developments. Pete and Tim, stick around a little bit longer. Up next for us, a reminder from Pete on why every single occupant in this meeting we're talking about, this Team Crazy gathering in the Oval Office, whether they knew it at the time or not, had been bought, suckered, or seduced by none other than Russia. We'll explain that next.